Hi everyone, welcome back. We are here to answer some more questions about your crime writing and to remind you about our Killing It competition, looking for undiscovered voices writing crime and thrillers. So Sophie and Catherine are here with me to answer more questions. Another question we've had in was, how could you improve the pace of your book? Sophie, you were mentioning pace earlier. Do you want to take this one first?
How to improve the pace of it? I suppose structure. You look at your structure, and there are so many different tools and different things work for different writers. But I know that having a clear timeline, plotting your chapters, again, I've said this before in part one, but your readers are looking for plot holes. So the more you have a really clear structure in your head and on paper ideally and all over your wall or wherever it needs to be, the easier it'll be to make sure that your pacing is right, because you'll know what's happening when. And once that's out of the way, I think it's easier to put the pace in. But then again, I'm not a writer, and Phoebe, you are, so maybe you've got a much better or clearer answer than I'd have.
I think you're right. That's a really good tip. I think sometimes with pacing, I find if you focus on the beginning and end of a chapter, that can be quite useful in terms of, like you were saying earlier, Catherine, you want people to keep turning the pages and just read one more chapter, one more page, and then eventually get to the end of the book. So I sometimes find making the beginning and the end of a chapter as tense as possible, and even if you think it's tense, maybe go one step further. I sometimes think adding even just like a line on the end can just put a seed of doubt in the reader's mind and make them think, oh, actually I must know what happens next, I'm going to read another page. So maybe focusing on beginning and end of chapters could be a good tip. And like you said, Sophie, sometimes pacing just isn't there in the first draft, and it's something that you have to actively go back in and add. And sometimes it's about cutting out words as well. Sometimes you can, less can be more, and if you strip things back a little bit, the pacing improves. Anything do you want to add, Catherine?
So a while back I went to a seminar with Robert McKee, who wrote a brilliant book called Story, and I remember one of the things I took from that, which was so useful, is to basically separate out each scene you have in your story and to think about what's happened at the beginning of that scene and what's happened at the end, and to work out how the story has moved on in that scene. And are you upping the stakes? Has something changed with the characters? Has the jeopardy got even bigger? And if it's not happened, then that means that it's going to be a flat scene and that you're not going to be moving on in the same way. So kind of actually writing it out and thinking to yourself, in a very deliberate way, each scene needs to move it on, then that's automatically going to make it a pacier, faster read, I think.
It's funny, isn't it? Because the pace is what carries readers through, but actually it takes time when you're the writer to put it in. Like the way you're describing it, Catherine, it's something that you do have to be tactical about, and you do have to structurally put in. It can't just be the same experience that the reader has, which is just reading along, like racing to the end.
And what do you both think about chapter lengths? Because I've got so many different authors who write, some write 2-page chapters, like really, really short, snappy ones, and then other ones write much longer but are pacier in their own way. Which do you think is better, or do you think it just depends on the book?
I think it depends on the book. I often favour short chapters as well. I don't know what that says about my concentration span, but I have quite a lot of authors that write quite short, snappy chapters, and there ends up being a lot of them. But equally, I think it really depends on the book, and it depends as well how many character point of views you're putting across. Because if you're writing, say, a psychological thriller and you have a couple of maybe unreliable narrators and you're sort of switching point of view every chapter or every couple of chapters, sometimes you need more chapters to give the reader those breaks. But I really think it depends on the novel.
I think also I completely agree, and I think that it doesn't just have to be chapters. So like Cara Hunter does this really well. She puts different text messages or articles and things in, and that can work really well with pacing as well, because it's a break for your reader. It's a chance to kind of switch your brain into a different mode, and that can help sort of drive the story on as well in ways that you might not do just with a normal body of text.
I agree. I love a good letter or a text or something like that, just to kind of, I think it refreshes you a bit and gets you ready for the next bit.
Yeah, I do. And I actually, Cara Hunter does do that really well, but a lot of authors now are starting to use these other kind of mediums, maybe a snippet from a podcast recording or a newspaper page, which happens a lot in crime novels. And actually sometimes you can get across a point really quickly by putting in a news article saying, a body's been found on this beach, rather than having a really long drawn out scene in which the police find the body. So like you say, you can give your reader that break, so it can work quite well. The other thing I would say about pacing is if you read a lot, you might pick up on the way other authors use pacing. So I think Shari Lapena has really amazing pacing, Claire McIntosh, Lisa Jewell. So if you read around the genre that you want to write in, you might pick up the way that they do pacing. Like I've literally looked at books and underlined stuff before and kind of actually made notes to see how they've managed to get such a great pace. So there's no harm in doing a bit of homework if you would like to.
And I think even just sometimes reading it aloud as well, that if you start reading it aloud and you find that you're getting faster and faster as you keep reading, it means that it's because it's got that really exciting pace to it. So I think that's quite a good thing to do as well.
Definitely. And also we have a lot to say about pacing, it turns out, but I think sometimes dialogue can improve pacing, because I know when I'm reading on my Kindle, my eyes automatically skim to the dialogue sections and I have to actively go back and read the paragraphs beforehand so I don't miss anything. And I think dialogue and that kind of short, sharp back and forth between characters can automatically speed up the reading process and improve the pace. Yeah, great. Next tip, do you have any tips for good characterization in commercial fiction? So yeah, from pace to characterization.
I have one which is completely personal preference, and it's not all the time, but quite often I like the main character, or at least some of the characters, to be someone that I feel I could almost know. It doesn't have to be someone that is me or someone that's one of my friends or my family, but getting that really good sense of that someone that you can place in your life. I think it's quite good, because so often these books are sort of what if scenarios, or sort of they feel very much like the world that we live in. So having those characters that are identifiable with people that you know in real life is quite effective, for me at least.
I think the big thing that I always tell my authors is that you need to know exactly what your character has been through in their life. So for each character, you should know where they were born and what their childhood was like, and all the different pinpoints in their life that has made them into what they are today. And in particular, kind of how all those experiences have shaped them into the character that they are now, and why they have, if they've got personal problems, why they have the personal problems, that kind of thing. And I'm not saying that you have to put in all of that background information. You probably don't want to put that in, because it'll become quite heavy if you do. But just knowing that in the back of your mind will automatically make them a much more three-dimensional person on the page itself.
Yeah, that's such a good point. I totally agree with that. Yeah, and I think as well, what you said, Sophie, about knowing them. Like I know, I can't actually remember who it is, but there's one author who she said something really interesting on Instagram about how, I think it was Gillian McAllister maybe, but she said she always imagines her character sitting next to her and saying, what would you like to drink, or how would you take your tea, or just something universal like that, so she gets to know her character. I hope she doesn't mind me passing that on. I think hopefully she won't, because it was online. But yeah, I think that's a really interesting tip. And something else I sometimes tell my authors is using what I would call the zoom in technique, where you imagine you've got a microscope and you're really zooming in on a character and you're kind of seeing them in a lot of detail. So rather than just, and you don't have to describe this all on the page, but just kind of knowing that information in your head. So zooming in on the way they walk, or their handwriting, or just these tiny little things that make up their character, rather than just sort of sticking to the really basic physical details, like they have blonde hair and they're really tall, or just actually delve a bit deeper than that. And whether that's with their physicality or their kind of inner emotional side, it can be quite fun just to kind of really zoom in and see how far inward you can go. Another question more about the competition. What are some things to avoid when submitting to the Killing It competition? Well, I've got one, which is when you're sending your manuscript in, just be careful to follow the guidelines, which we'll post up after this. But what we're looking for is to see a synopsis and a short paragraph just telling us a bit about yourself, and then the first 10,000 words. So if you just follow those guidelines, it just will make it much easier for us to read through everything. Hopefully they're fairly straightforward, but yeah, just be careful not to send us a full manuscript or to forget the synopsis, because things like that will just make it a bit harder to consider your submission in the best possible way. So that's just a very practical one.
I think for me, it's the synopsis. If it goes on for about 20 pages, then I find it really hard to concentrate on that. So I think the shorter, the better. And I know that as authors, you want to be able to get in every single plot twist in there. But I think for us, particularly when we just open it up, we want to see the main hooks and the main characters. And sort of the very overarching theme of the story, but we don't need to see every single scene twist. So that's kind of my 2 cents.
Yeah, I would add to this. So before I worked in a publishing house, I worked at an agency. So I've been on the beginning as well. So when writers send their manuscript in to be considered for representation by an agent. And I think, just to mirror what Catherine says, the synopsis is so important, because it's not just a pitch for you. And editors have said this before, so you've probably heard it before, but it's a pitch for the agent, and it's a pitch for the editor to the rest of their team. So it's if you need to get it clear in your head, and then we'll have it clear in our head, and that's is a really powerful tool. So it's not just something that you whack onto the end before you send off your manuscript. Like it should be a really considered part of your application.
Definitely, yeah.
I think as well that if you can sort of distill your book to just a one line, really hooky, punchy line, I know it's really difficult, but if you can get something we can use that in house, as Sophie says, to kind of pitch it to the rest of our teams, and our sales team can use it to pitch it to supermarkets and bookstores. So it's kind of, if you can nail that one line really exciting pitch, then that's going to be the thing that carries it right the way through publication.
Definitely. Great. So yeah, those are a few things to avoid. The other thing I would say was don't get too worried about making it like super perfect. Like I've been looking at the inbox earlier today, and there's a few people resending and saying, oh, I'm really sorry, I made like a typo or mistake in that original draft. And honestly, like, please don't worry if there's a couple of typos. Like, obviously try and make the writing as clean as you can, but we're not gonna not choose you to win because of a typo. It's not that big of a deal at this stage. So yeah, if you feel like you've done your absolute best on it, then do just send it and bite the bullet. I know it can be really hard to let go of your writing, and you want to make sure it's really error-free, but please don't worry about resending if there's a small mistake like that, because it won't put us off, don't worry. Next question, what are some of the best crime books that you have read recently? Well, we have all read a lot of crime books recently, I would say. Anything that stands out to you guys?
I'm looking for my Kindle, I don't know where it's gone.
And I always freeze when we get this, because I think we read submissions so far ahead of time that it's hard to know what I've read that's actually has come out in the marketplace.
Yeah, I'm trying to, that's exactly the problem I've got. I'm trying to remember what I've read on a Kindle and what I've read from a book.
I think some of the books that stood out, so My Sister the Serial Killer, I thought was just really fresh and exciting, and something that I hadn't read before, so I loved reading that. Ruth Ware was one of my go-tos, so I will buy everything that she writes as soon as it's published. I've actually still got the new one on my Kindle, so I can't wait to read that one. And I don't know if you count it as a crime book, Where the Crawdads Sing, I absolutely loved. I mean, it's got a crime element in it, but just that kind of escapism to, I think it was North Carolina, and I thought it was just so brilliantly done and evocative and everything. So those are some of mine.
Yeah, I've not read that much recently, because we're always reading submissions for work, but last year I read Finders Keepers by Sabine Durant, which I loved. I thought that was actually a really good example of characterization. If you're looking for something specific on great characterization, I would definitely recommend reading that. That was a great read. Sophie, have you found your Kindle or thought?
I'm going to say the one that comes to mind first, so which is obviously the one that I've enjoyed the most, because it's in my mind, The Confessions of Franny Langton, which we've just finished. And it's just a really good, I read a lot of historical literature when I was a teenager, but I haven't read much in recent years, and it's kind of really introduced me back into that genre. I think historical crime fiction can when it's done well, is really, really good, and it's a bit different to some of the other like psychological thrillers that we publish. So yeah, that was a really good, refreshing, difficult at times, but a really good read. Yeah, I think one of the things that was interesting about it was that it's a familiar historical setting for us, because you get period dramas about it all the time, but just a completely different person, like a different story, and I think that was what was so interesting about it and made it feel so new and like exciting.
Yeah, I love that too. It was
See it in a
very
different perspective.
really evocative writing as well. And I would also just say someone that I always say is Susie Steiner, who writes police procedural novels with an amazing female detective called Manon Bradshaw, who I just think is one of the best female detectives I've ever read. She has 3 books out. So yeah, she's definitely one of my favourite in terms of police novels. I think she's great. And then a final question is, how does the editorial process in a big publishing house like HarperCollins usually work? Maybe we'll start with you, Sophie, because you've kind of seen it from both sides, so maybe you could just say the kind of agent. Then
so right from the start, from the very first.
Well, I just thought that might be interesting just to say how that bit works.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So it would come to an agency. So if you're an author and you decide to go through an agency, then you submit your manuscript to a few specific agents who you like, the other books that they publish and the other authors that they represent, because each agent has very personal taste. So you choose them, they like your book, so they sign you, and then they submit it to a publisher like HarperCollins, and they will submit it to, that they'll know that this is a book that Phoebe might really like, or that Catherine might really like. So they'll send it to Phoebe or Catherine with a note saying, this reminds me of such and such, or I thought you'd like this because. And again, that's why you want a good synopsis, because the agent will use that as a tool to make it really clear to the editor why they might like that book. So yeah, and then it lands on the editor's desk, and normally at that point it might land on my desk as well, because I'm the assistant editor, so I help with a lot of submission reading. So yeah, and then we're considering it as a team. So I suppose Catherine, you could take us from there.
So go from that point. So we would, it would come into one of us to read and consider for publication. So we would put it on our Kindles and read as soon as we can. And if we like it, it kind of depends how quickly we think it might go. If we think we might have a little bit of time on it, we might share it with the rest of the Crime and Thriller team, which is the 3 of us and Julia Wisdom. If we think it might go really quickly, we might go straight out to the wider Harper Fiction team with a really hopefully exciting pitch on, this is going to be a big book because X, Y, and Z, and you will love it because X, Y, and Z. And so at that point it goes around to the wider team for them all to read, and that will be marketing, sales, publicities, everyone who would be involved in the whole publication of the book. And then we would take it to an acquisitions meeting, which we have once a week, and we as editors have to pitch it to the rest of the group and hope that everyone else agrees that it's a really good book. At that point, if everyone does like it, then we would make an offer on it for the agent. And there's sort of various options of what happens at that point, depending on if other publishers are interested or if it's just us. So, that kind of thing always goes on, but essentially the majority of the time it's, can we offer enough money to be able to be the ones to actually buy it? And hopefully if we love a book, then we're going to be able to offer what the agent wants and what the author wants. So in that case, then we would acquire it. And then Phoebe, do you want to take over from?
Yeah, and then the last bit, so once we've actually acquired a manuscript, we do various boring things like the paperwork and get the contract sorted out. The editor will do things like brief the cover design and give that to our amazing art department, speak to marketing and publicity and start putting plans together for publication. And then in the actual editorial side that the author is involved in, we would normally do a big structural edit first. So I would normally write a letter to the author saying the main things that I think might need looking at. So that might be big stuff like maybe changing the ending or bringing out a character more or anything like that. Sometimes it's not as big as that, sometimes it's smaller. It just really depends on the book and how much work I think it needs. So I'll put all that together in a letter. It's usually a couple of pages long, send that over to the author, and they'll have a bit of time to work on these edits. They then send it back to me. I usually do another round, so either I go through line by line and do smaller bits and bobs, or just do another read through and do another shorter letter if it needs a little bit less work. Send it back again, so there's a bit of back and forth. Then we freelance out the copy edit, so it goes to someone external from HarperCollins, because by that point the editor has read it so many times, quite hard to see the wood for the trees. The copy editor would then go through and check things like, you know, whether someone's going to school on a Sunday, or whether someone's wearing a blue coat one day and the next day it's green, and checking for like inconsistencies.
It always amazes but it always amazes me how brilliant our copy editors are, and that they can spot like, oh, the Olympics wasn't actually that year, like 70 years ago, it was a different year, and things like that. Like it's really amazing.
Yeah, they are super eagle-eyed. So they will point all that sort of stuff out, and it then goes back to the author again to do that. And then the final stage of the editing process is the proofread, which again we freelance out. And that's when an external proofreader will read through the typeset pages to check for typos and just basic errors that we might not have caught. There's definitely always a few, more than a few. So those are kind of the 4 stages: structural, then line, then copy, then proofread. And at that point, you're basically good to go. And the author can kind of relax for a little bit until it becomes publication day, and that is kind of a whole nother Zoom conversation, what happens then. But yeah, that's kind of start to finish of the acquisition and the editorial process. So I think that's pretty much all of our questions. In case either of you got anything else to add.
I think that's it. I think just to say that we'll can't wait to start reading all submissions. So if you're debating whether or not to send it, then send it, because we're ready and raring to go.
Yeah, definitely. So to reiterate, the deadline is April the 7th, so you've still got another couple of weeks to send in your manuscript. We're going to choose 3 winners. Those 3 winners will receive editorial feedback from us and consultations. We also have an exciting guest judge who is going to be doing her own video over in the next few weeks, and she's going to be giving her top 10 tips for crime writers, so watch this space to hear those. But yeah, if you're sitting on the fence, please consider submitting to us. As long as it's crime, thriller, or suspense, it's got a bit of darkness in it, we would love to see. All the details will be posted up here alongside this chat. If you have any questions, you can comment here, or you can drop us an email, and we will do our best to get back to you before the deadline. Thank you so much for listening to our chat.